good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Lauren Sorkin from the Global Resilient Cities Network, and I'm here to welcome you to the 7th edition of the World Bank Global Resilient Cities Speaker Series, Cities on the Front Line, Responding to the Coronavirus with Resilience. Let me start by stating the obvious. For those of us, and all of us as your hosts and speakers tonight are sitting here in Singapore, it's been a very hard and it's been a rather sad week. And our speakers will soon address the lessons that we're learning here in Singapore. And before I turn it over to Francis from the World Bank to introduce the speakers, I just want to first express my thanks to both of our speakers for being here through this challenging and very demanding time, and for sharing with all of us so that we can learn with and from Singapore. I also want to remind everyone of the ground rules for this conversation. This is a practitioner's conversation, and so we are all sharing with each other in the spirit of learning and helping our cities and communities on the ground, and hopefully even saving lives. These calls are not on the record, so if you want to quote someone who presents here tonight, please do reach out to us from Global Resilient Cities Network, and we will help you to get in touch with the speakers if you want to use their materials or quote them from this evening. And also, we're using a new format this evening. We're on WebEx. We're still going to use the same process for questions, which is to use the Q&A function and type those in Q&A. If you want to just say hello or chat, use the chat. And if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Francis.
And I also would like to welcome you all to this 7th edition of our Cities in the Frontline speaker series. As Lauren said, Lauren and I both currently live in Singapore, so today's presentation will be close to home. Singapore has been praised for the way it responded to the first wave of COVID-19 outbreak, yet the city is now really struggling to contain a second wave of infection, which is particularly affecting immigrant worker dormitories. We'll have two speakers. Dr. Jeremy Lin is the co-director of global health at the National University of Singapore, Swee Hock School of Public Health. He will give us an overview of Singapore response, its successes, and recent difficulties. He will use some of his time to discuss the situation of migrant worker dormitories in effort to address it. Melissa Kwee is the CEO of Singapore's National Volunteer and Philanthropy Center. She will tell us how civil society actors across the cities are uniting to take care of the most vulnerable, and of course she'll also talk about their work trying to support the migrant workers who are particularly affected. Jeremy and Melissa will both speak for about 20 minutes, which should leave us 15-20 minutes for Q&A. As Lauren said, please ask your question in the Q&A section of the WebEx. We'll try to group them and then ask them as they come along. So without further ado, Dr. Lim, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Francis, and a very good morning or good evening to everyone, wherever in the world you are. Yes, and as was introduced, Singapore is undergoing a rather challenging period now, and it's very well worth having a discussion over what went right and what went wrong. Can I go to the first slide, please? All right. And maybe as the first speaker, let me just provide a very quick overview about Singapore that may not be known to all the participants who are dialing or already listening in. I think many people recognize Singapore as this global cosmopolitan city very, very densely populated, and 90% of the population live in high-rise buildings. And what's probably fairly unique is that Singapore has been ruled by the same political party since independence, and this political party certainly intends to stay in power for the next 20 to the next 50 years, and so it has very strong control. It also has and it's also very concerned about the future and the sort of Singapore that its successors would then be governing over. Singapore started on a digital hub journey many years ago, so there's a high degree of really technological sophistication. The equivalent of Uber in the US and all the various Deliveroos and Food Pandas, all of them are here in Singapore, right? And of course, in 2003, Singapore was epidemic, and from this we have learned valuable lessons, and it's also colored a lot of thinking around how Singapore is dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. So this is where we are as of yesterday, and I think as was pointed out earlier, Singapore did really well in the first wave, and the first wave defined as managing the imported cases, those who came from the tourists who came from really China, and Singaporeans who had returned from basically high risk really geographies, right? But at one point in time, we were the third country to report cases, and about 2 months ago, we were the worst hit country outside mainland China. But with strong measures, this was essentially brought under control. However, there was what we describe as a cognitive blind spot. And I think hand on heart, we can speak very candidly, the government underestimated the velocity and the severity of the outbreaks in the worker dormitories. And the numbers look very manageable for the community. However, if you look at the axis in the really dormitory resident population, we've been averaging 1,000 over cases every day, whereas out in the community, it's typically 20, 30 cases every day. So really Singapore's fighting on two battlefronts. There is the wider community and the specific, very, very heated battle that's in the worker dormitories. Singapore declared a circuit breaker, which is a euphemism for a lockdown, and this will carry on until June the 1st. Next slide, please. So maybe before we talk about specific measures, we should talk about what the general really approach is. And I guess you could think of Singapore as a very as a highly sophisticated car with lots of electronic parts, lots of moving parts, and 7 gears. And many other countries would probably have only 3 or 4 gears. But the problem when you have many, many parts and high degree of really sophistication is that when one thing breaks down, everything is then at risk. But because Singapore has always governed on this premise, it's small, compact, and it is well regulated. And this then has shaped Singapore's approach, which is really to enable essential services to continue as far as possible and to allow the lifestyle to be as normal or as tolerable as much as is possible. And hence, Singapore did not announce draconian lockdown measures. These were very calibrated and they were progressively ramped up. Of course, this was very confusing to really because every other day there would be new measures that would be introduced, and the government fought this battle on all fronts. Massive campaigns in the newspapers, in social media, a lot of public pressure, actors and other celebrities coming on TV to appeal to people to maintain social distancing measures, and of course to balance the carrots with a number of sticks, which included changes to the legislative framework on an emergency basis to allow for fines and also potentially jail terms for those who breach social distancing and home quarantine measures. And secondly, looking at what had been happening everywhere around the world, there was also a very meticulous effort to ramp up healthcare capacity and lots of changes in the strategy, in the broad approach as new knowledge emerged and the new realities were essentially recognized. Next slide, please. So let's just talk about the first wave and this is the one that Singapore was really highly praised for. And I go back to the philosophy of keeping life as normal as is possible. So most services and most amenities remained open with essentially social distancing measures. And some of these photos show you that Singapore must have a strategic stockpile of a lot of duct tape because almost overnight, the floors, the tables were all marked out. This is where you can sit. This is where you cannot sit. This is where you should stand to queue, and so on and so forth. We also recognize that social distancing and the need to close off visits to nursing homes and really some of these do bring a very tangible emotional cost, and hence the use of technology to maintain relationships and have that emotional contact were really part and parcel of the first wave. Next slide, please. But even Singapore started to think that we could get through, then bad things happened. And one was that there was a niggling persistence of unlinked cases, meaning cases that could not be attributed to any previous cluster. And secondly, the outbreak in the foreign worker dormitories. And the intention of this circuit breaker period, like most other countries, is to break the chain of transmission and essentially people interact physically with each other for as little as is possible. So most businesses, probably about 85% of businesses have been ordered to close or to work remotely, and schools have effectively closed with essentially home-based learning. And here, if I take us to the earlier point, that Singapore is technologically very sophisticated, very, very wired up. So home-based learning has been fully possible for most of the students. And I'm sure Melissa will speak later about what society or what the community has been doing for that proportion of basically families who may not be able to afford or already access the necessary infrastructure for really home-based learning. Something that Singapore has also done is to really marry the public health interventions with a massive economic rescue package that's about 12% of Singapore's GDP. And this financial support was targeted at individuals, businesses, and also particular industries, such as the private hire, which would be the equivalent of Uber in the US, as well as the airline and the tourism industries. But all that said, if you look at some of these photos where there's one person who is on the train that's unheard of, and these are very, very unusual circumstances. And I think there's full recognition that despite the financial support and the economic rescue packages, it's still very, very tough for everybody. And there is a risk of lockdown fatigue that we're starting to see in some other countries, and in Singapore, I'm sure it will also surface. Next slide, please. So if I move from the first guiding principle of keeping life as normal as is possible, while still maintaining public health interventions, the next thrust is really around ramping up healthcare capacity. I had mentioned SARS in 2003, and one of the decisions that was made after SARS was that Singapore needed its own specialty hospital. And this hospital is called the NCID. It's a purpose-built hospital with about 300 beds. And this hospital in really routine time remains just a shell. It's got all the facilities, but it has no staff. And the game plan that was implemented early on in the COVID-19, all the other government hospitals would then devote some of their clinical headcount into the NCID to help to run it on a 24/7 basis. This was very early on demonstrated to be insufficient, and cases were then spilled over to the other hospitals. And we also started to use fairly creative means, such as holiday resorts that were then converted into isolation facilities. and also the large convention centers. And the photo that's in the bottom left, this is of the Singapore Expo, which is a large exhibition hall that's been converted into what we call a community isolation facility. And this houses about 3,000 patients. And essentially, as we're all familiar with COVID-19 patients, they run through a whole spectrum from very, very severe disease to very mild disease. But the challenge is that even with the patients with very mild disease, they may still be infectious. And hence the government policy, at least thus far, has been to keep all the positive cases out of the community, isolated until they return with 2 negative swabs. And that's taking a really, really long time. There have been some patients who have had positive swabs for 30, 40, 50 days, and that's really imposing a lot on the healthcare capacity. Next slide, please. So if I can end off by making some comments about the foreign worker dormitory outbreak, and I'll make these comments wearing 2 hats, one as a public health really academic, and the other is in my hat as the chair of the Medical Services Committee for a migrant worker charity that provides healthcare services. And I've been seeing patients in our clinics for the last 8 years, so a little bit familiar with the circumstances. And I think it is very, very clear that in the early parts of COVID-19, the government was singularly focused on how to manage the cases and manage Singaporeans, including the very large numbers who were based overseas. And unfortunately, as senior diplomat Bilahari says, that we dropped the ball. And I think no one in government anticipated that the outbreaks could be so severe and affect so many dorm workers in such a brief period of time. So just to give a sense that on the 1st of April, Singapore had just under 1,000 cases. Now we fast forward just over 3 weeks, we have crossed the 10,000 case threshold, and almost all the new cases are in the foreign worker dormitories. And I think many of you would be familiar that Singapore has about 1/3 of the Singapore workforce is made up of foreign workers who essentially live in dormitories that range from a couple of hundred occupants to some of the largest that you see in this big red circle that easily has 25,000 people. So from a public health control point of view, these are extremely challenging issues. Next slide, please. Right. And we can talk about whether the government should have seen this coming and could we have mitigated it early on during the Q&A. But let me focus this time on what has been the strategy to address the migrant worker or the foreign worker population. First is find where all the positive cases are and separate them from the rest. Secondly, we really have to reduce the density of foreign worker dormitories, and with 12 to 20 workers staying in one room and sharing communal facilities such as common kitchens, common washrooms, it's just impossible to maintain effective social distancing. And hence, infrastructure for the workers to be moved out really had to be mobilized at very short notice. And the government, I must say to its credit, did a really good job and was quite creative, which is not a term you tend to associate with the Singapore government. But the healthy workers were moved to army camps. There was even a floating hotel, void decks, and so on and so forth. So only the government can mobilize this at very short notice, and the principles were minimal infrastructure work so that we keep the cost down. We can move very, very quickly. And my understanding, speaking to the landowners, is that as far as possible, it has been on commercially viable terms. Certainly not generous, but basically viable. Next slide, please. Right, so if I can sum up, this is where we are. We are probably at the midpoint of the second chapter, and it's very riveting with a lot of anxious moments for us who are involved in some of the efforts. Some of my concluding thoughts are that This is really a collective societal effort, and I'm sure Melissa will spend her time talking about how the government cannot manage by itself and the community really has to step in. It's got to be multi-pronged, rolling out public health interventions without economic rescue packages, without looking at a modicum of normal societal functioning would not allow the public to buy in. Secondly, really thirdly, um, for all cities, the surge capacity has to be, it is absolutely critical to plan for. Singapore planned for 300 odd cases plus some capacity that could be freed up by cancelling electives, moving the non-urgent cases to 6 months down. But even that, in the face of 10,000 cases, was not adequate. And a lot of creativity then is needed to solve all of these problems. Um, it has been said that generals always fight the last war. And I think Singapore started COVID-19 with the SARS playbook. But COVID-19 very quickly turned out to be a totally new war with a very, very different virus. And we just have to develop new solutions in real time and by our experience and learning from others. And that's why forums such as these become so valuable. And I think Singapore is learning the very, very hard way that everyone was focused on two battlefronts. The cases that were imported because Singapore is a major transport hub. The second battlefront was really community spread, people living in the HDB flats and so on, spreading to each other, and completely underestimated the third battlefront, which is the worker dormitories. And collectively, all the worker dormitories account for about 350,000 persons. And we are now in the thick of this battle, and fingers crossed that we will escape with relatively little permanent damage. And on this note, I will end and hand the time to Melissa. Thank you very much.
Melissa, I think you're mute. You go ahead.
Let's see, how do I do this now? Let's see. Oh, there we go. Share. Do you see it? Are you good?
Yes.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that correct? Is that good? Okay.
It's working.
Great. Well, good evening, everyone, or good morning to some of you too. Thank you so much, Jeremy, for just setting the context for Singapore. Thank you, Lauren and team and World Bank team actually too for introducing. I want to speak first before I do my presentation actually as a Singaporean, as a migrant, because I'm also my mother is Japanese American, my father is Indonesian Chinese. I'm a first generation born in Singapore, Singaporean in my family. I want to speak as a consumer who wants cheap goods, and I want to speak as a human being. And I want to say to the countries who have migrant workers in our country, actually too, that I'm very, very sorry. I'm so sorry that the situation has actually become what it is right now, and I just think it is something that we haven't done our best, and we need to figure out how we're going to do this better. It's a very painful lesson, I think, that everyone is having here in Singapore, and it's one that I really pray is one that we do not lose. They say never waste a good crisis. It would be a travesty if we did that. So my presentation, as Laura mentioned, is actually around the civil society and the corporate, the people to COVID-19. And I work for the National Volunteer Philanthropy Center, NVPC, and we have a vision of Singapore as the city of good. And we think the city of good is a place where we consider others before ourselves and where people come together to give their best for others. And so the theme actually for the presentation this evening is around how COVID has enabled us to reveal, reimagine, and reset. There we go. So if you think about Singapore, it's the place of opportunity. So it's easy to have national pastimes like shopping and eating. We have a national characteristic, which is known as GRCN, which in Hokkien means afraid to lose. And of course, those of you who probably have not known Singapore in the entertainment space were probably aware that we were also the venue for Freedom last year. One might ask ourselves at this point, is this really enough? Do we have enough? And frankly, are we doing good enough? And perhaps in all of that having and doing, we've been a very smart nation. And so I think Jen has touched on some of the advances that were perhaps best in class in the beginning. Things like our Trace Together app, which could actually identify what people were geospatially, so it was a space out app so that we could avoid very crowded places. There were so many technical solutions actually that were really well implemented and very good, which is part of our smart nation vision in a sense for Singapore. But I think we also have to ask ourselves, beyond being a smart nation, why are you a smart nation? For what purpose? And I think that this crisis has actually given us an opportunity to reveal perhaps that bigger purpose. So in summary, the crisis is revealing the different fractures, the different fissures in society. It is giving us an opportunity to reimagine this future that we would like to see and build that city of good. And it's giving us an opportunity to reset. And this extended circuit breaker that we're in right now, too, which is just announced around for another 5 weeks, is giving all of us, or is removing for all of us, rather, the excuse that we can just hang on a bit longer. And actually, we do have to deal with the challenges that are going to be around. Because I think the fact is, too, that we're seeing that those who struggled before COVID are struggling even more now.
Melissa, I'm sorry to interrupt. The sound is coming in and out a little bit. Is there a way to go closer to your microphone?
Okay, I will try. Is that better?
A little bit. That's a little bit better.
Okay. Okay, I will try. Hopefully that's a bit better. So then for us, the question around revealing has been to see, as I mentioned, the people who were digitally excluded, whether that's the isolated seniors, whether that's children from low-income families who struggled with the home-based learning because they didn't have laptops or Wi-Fi data plans, whether it's people that were on meals assistance before, and when volunteers said, "I'm afraid to go out and do that," then, and many of our volunteers actually doing that are older people, there was a need for new people to come forth to actually help deliver things like food. And so for us, it's really just revealing how much we focus on ourselves versus focusing on others, how much we've been able to see and then serve others. And I think the other critical part that it's revealed is who are the real leaders in our society who have what I call bridging capital, that are able to connect the different worlds and connect the private, the public, and the people sector together to help better visualize, to help better resource map, and to create better solutions for this going forward. So what are the kinds of things that we're seeing? Well, we're seeing the food banks step up in a massive way to distribute thousands of these meals to the various vulnerable groups. They're actually coordinating a group of many other SME caterers who are also closed in that sense now and have lost business, but they decided, hey, let's get together and help support, create a supply chain which is serving thousands and thousands of meals every day. It's also an opportunity for families to also rethink about what's important for them. And for families to remember that they can write notes to our healthcare staff. They can support frontliners in other ways, and they can teach their kids about the kinds of values of resilience that that is just so important that may have been lost in our time of plenty. We're also seeing arts and music groups coming back. The Singapore Symphony Orchestra is putting music online. We have, our popular musicians and artists actually too, creating at-home sessions for people. We've had various groups, actually, concerned citizens, developing their own campaigns around masks, even before masks were told that were said to be a good thing. And for the migrants, various roundup groups, as well as organizations, have come together to create coalitions to help feed, help provide clothes and support, and even translators have come in to say, hey, it's Bengali New Year, it's Ramadan is coming up. How do we make Myanmar New Year recently? How do we help to just offer communication to people at this time too, when perhaps our normal communication channels have not been very strong. We run Giving.sg, which is a national giving portal. It's for donations, volunteering, and both in skills and so forth, and in-kind donations. After the solidarity budget, and Singaporeans each got $600, we did about 10x of what was sort of like the normal donations actually due to various charities, and this was aided by various influencers, including the Deputy Prime Minister, as well as various other media personalities and so forth. And let's remember, let's keep some perspective, let's have a sense of purpose, and remember that there are others who need our help. Another thing that we've been doing to try and sense make and to organize resources is put together a donations in kind site that has listed various charities, and now we're working on one for migrant workers that identifies specific needs that they have, and puts it out there to visualize to the public how they can help too. So this has actually also been aiding in the flow of resources so that there's little or less, I suppose, wastage or duplication or underserved areas. That's as part of the SB United effort. So I think the big challenge and perhaps the big question for us now is really to begin to imagine what, now knowing what we know now, how do we reimagine this better future? And I think there's three main questions that we can start to think about right now. One is, if we believe that change happens at the speed of trust, then how do we think about the places where we have not been able to build trust or we have lost trust, and how do we identify people who can help bridge to other groups that may be alienated from us so that we can build or rebuild trust? Second question is a personal commitment, I think, as leaders, to ask ourselves how we can stay the course, because certainly change is hard. And how do we do it? I think the third piece is how do we do it together? And how do we build various multi-stakeholder groups where leaders are coming together, not just for their own narrow purposes or profit or power, but actually for the greater good across all of those different domains to redefine what success and a good life really looks like. Two areas I want to just mention in this respect. One is, in society, platform businesses, networks are one of the most powerful things, just really connecting and running in a sense our lives. Now the question is, what if we leverage the biggest platforms available for good? And for example, we have all these delivery services, in our various countries matching, needs and wants. for consumers at this point, how do we extend that now for vulnerable groups too, by bringing together public, private, and community collaboration? I think the other big idea for us is with respect to the migrant workers community is how do we accelerate some kind of, how do we think, how do we innovate, how do we think creatively and differently about the different sub-communities, the different dorm communities, the migrant communities that are out there? Could we, for example, have local communities which adopt these dorm communities? And practice the kind of welcome and hospitality and care for guests in our country, that could actually create a kind of reintegration, the kind of welcome, the kind of restoration, actually, too, that is necessary. And it is also an opportunity to recognize and honor truly the people who have also built our country. So in summary, what will it take? We need to see clearly, both in terms of a vision as well as the visualization of data and knowledge. We need to see differently and provide our various talents and resources in service of others, a greater group, to share and to give, to leverage our diverse networks, and always to encourage our spirits in this group. So ultimately, the last piece is after COVID, the post-COVID reality now is perhaps one of the important things to also have as our North Star, so that we don't waste this crisis. We don't go back to the old normal, but we create new normals that get us to a very different place. So with that, I'd just like to thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. And I hope maybe in these intervening minutes, we'll figure out how to get your mic really, really clearly, because we can see you very clearly, but the audio is going in and out a bit. But both presentations really, I think, had visuals and also messages that were very clear for the audience. And there have been a number of questions that have come out, in particular around the issues of vision and foresight. So it was great to see your presentation ending on that, Melissa, with the quote as well from Helen Keller. I'm going to ask a question for both of you, and maybe we'll have Jeremy you answer first, and then go back to Melissa, hopefully with our renewed clarity of audio. The question is really, what are the values and principles that we can apply that will allow us to avoid blind spots and these kind of biases or cognitive blind spots that we might have in policy in particular? And this is an interesting aspect that you pointed out, Jeremy. When you have a political party who's been in power for a long time and has that continuity, how do you get creative, and how do you make space and set up the processes for innovation?
And I think that our former Foreign Minister Georgios put it very nicely, where he argued that the should not be like a banyan tree, which is a tropical tree that has branches and roots that pretty much push out everybody. But instead, he aspired that the Singapore state would almost be like a very tall and proud pine cone, showing the way for everyone else, but not crowding out anybody. And I think one of the challenges here in Singapore is perhaps we've been a victim of our own success, that the dominant narrative around economic really efficiency and the power of good governance and this sort of single-minded purpose, and this critics would then argue has led the government to be less attentive to other voices. Because in all fairness, many of the NGO groups had been highlighting that the worker dormitories and the migrant workers were a particularly vulnerable group. And let me just say that as a public health professor, if any of my students in writing an essay about pandemics did not mention dormitories, they would have failed. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know this. And I think it was genuinely a cognitive blind spot, because Singapore has had its own version of really emphasizing Singaporeans first, channeling a lot of resources to really Singaporeans first. So some of the early exercises, such as distributing masks, really they had, and these interventions had excluded the migrant worker population. So what is the remedy? Maybe a little bit of humility, a more bubbling civil society, and much more respect and really mutual recognition of everyone's legitimacy. Back to you, Lauren.
Lauren, I'm going to try and does this sound better?
Awesome.
Yay! Okay,
Yeah.
wonderful. Okay, so sorry, I'm really terrible at these things. So what values are important in that? I mean, I think there's three things that I think are really important. I think Jeremy mentioned one of them, which is humility. Being able to be humbled, even at the risk of feeling humiliated, actually is really important. Because actually people will never trust you until they think that you're real and you're sincere. And that I think requires some humility. I think that the other point Jeremy touched on too is just the principle of inclusion. Now we talk about inclusion a lot. It's like one of those like horrible buzzwords that everybody says and nobody really knows what it means. You know, but I think the point is that have we welcomed diverse views to the table and perhaps trusted that they may have something of value, you know, before dismissing them. And I think inclusion means asking the question, who's not at the table that perhaps should be. And it goes, I mean, it's sort of normal in life. I mean, it happens all the time. I mean, I was on a youth organization, you know, one time with like no young people on the board. And I just thought, it's like, this is a bit strange. Or like you have like girls, you know, organizations run by like much older women or something, you know, I mean, or men, which is, you know, you're thinking, how does that, you got to have your stakeholders actually represented at the table. So inclusion. And I think the third point is the point that we have to be human, and we have to see humanity in others. And I think had we applied the same yardstick to the migrant workers in our country, we would not have allowed this to happen. So that's my thought. Humility, inclusion, and just being human.
Thank you, Jeremy and Melissa. The next question is much more down to earth. Despite a significant spike and quite a number of cases in Singapore, mortality has remained extremely low. And that maybe it's a question for both of you, because I think it relates to the medical system, but also to other factors. Do you see this continuing? And what do you think are the attributes that are making this possible, or that may not make it possible in the future? And maybe starting with you, Jeremy, since you're from the health profession, and then to you, Melissa. I think, Jeremy, you're still on mute completely. For some reason.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Firstly, I would say that Singapore's very low mortality is a complete outlier. It shouldn't be. We are very, very surprised. Multiple counterparts in other countries have asked, as really medical professionals, what's our secret? And the most embarrassing thing is that there is no secret. We're not providing patients with any particular antiviral cocktails or anything like that. It's just plain old supportive care, making sure that they have got all the nutrition they need, the oxygen, and all of this. But on your question, should we see more of this? Statistically, the answer should be no. At 10,000 cases, even with a 1% mortality, we're already talking about 100 persons, but we've only had 10. right? So there's something very unusual, and we certainly want to figure that out. Maybe the bulk of the infections have been that tend. So most of these, but certainly there is no strategy for a herd immunity and just let the virus run amok amongst the migrant worker population. It's still take the positive cases out, reduce the really density, and really manage everyone very, very proactively. Maybe Melissa, over to you.
I'm not a medical professional, so I really can't comment on that aspect. I think the emphasis that we have right now as a whole society, I mean, as a whole society, at least from government, has been on the health dimensions of this, specifically looking at mortality rates and infection rates as the two key KPIs. But I think we very much need to look at some of the other dimensions of impact, actually too. So the economic impact, which I think is going to be definitely a long, hard recovery, as well as sort of the social and psychological kind of dimensions that are also part of this recovery period too, and the social area in particular. Just as I was saying, those who were vulnerable before post-COVID are extremely vulnerable during COVID. And so falling off that the bus now is actually something we want to stop before that actually gets much worse.
Thank you both. This is another very down-to-earth question. The participants would like to know more about what should and could be done about gathering data, in particular for folks who don't have a regular legal address or migrant workers, and how can that data be used to measure progress and also to target services from the community and other groups?
Maybe Melissa, do you want to start the ball rolling, or should I?
Sure. I guess I can start. I think in terms of gathering data, there's a couple aspects of this. I mean, we're seeing this in sort of two dimensions. One dimension is really actually, maybe you can, maybe Jeremy can speak about the health part. We can speak about the sort of response part. So from the response aspect of it, there's both the identification of the needs. So how is it that we're gathering data about what are the needs that are out there? And then the other part of it is the offers, in a sense, like how is it that when people come forward, how do we then address data around gathering data and sense making the data around that? In terms of the need areas, you know, there's had to be a stronger reliance, not just on government systems, which have done I think have really done their best in this area through the various social service centers and the rest of that. But there are people who just don't go to those centers. So they're outside of that, network. But actually what one does need to do is actually figure out how does one reach the so-called unreached, you know, or the less connected folks out there. And I think there are a couple ways that we're sort of thinking about this. One is through businesses whose customers they are. So if you can reach people through, for example, if they're migrant workers, reach them through the remittance companies, or reach them through the telcos, you know, that actually have direct access to them too. Whether that's to share health, you know, communication information, whether that's to share you know, help where they can receive help and so forth. You know, those are sort of corporate and or informal social network channels. So for example, with the vulnerable individuals, socially isolated persons and things like that too, they are socially isolated. So how do you reach the socially isolated? Typically, the socially isolated live at least in neighborhoods. They just don't interact. So then the question is, can you activate neighbors and build a sense of public spiritedness where people can check on at least people, you know, 5 doors to the left and 5 doors to the right. And if everybody sort of does that, you can kind of touch, you know, a range of different folks. So anyway, the points corporate, and then looking at like activating informal neighbor networks. Then on the donations or on the support side of things, whether that's in-kind donations of like, medical supplies, PPE, masks, sanitizers. I mean, Ramadan's coming up, so dates, I mean, there's a whole range of different clothes, different things food, different things that people are sort of, this is where we're really trying to leverage the trust networks that we have across all the different groups to again, create kind of like a common database as much as possible. It's definitely very hard, but we're working on that now through the cityofgood.sg SG United site and one that's coming up for migrant workers specifically.
Yeah, and if I can chime in on the health side, I think that the contact tracing efforts have been very meticulous here in Singapore, probably not as technology enabled as they could be, because there are concerns about privacy. And I know that in other countries, the government has been less, how should we say, has been less shy about tapping on the telco data. And it's certainly true that the telcos have a lot of data. The telcos tells me that they have 4,000 over data points on each and every on each and every number every single day. Multiply that by a year, and that's millions of data points. So the data does exist, but I think Singapore had elected to not use this avenue as part of its contact tracing, and instead relied on good old police investigative type work, and also the really trace together app, which is voluntary. But that's unfortunately only been embraced by about 20-25% of the Singapore population. And of course, as really Mel pointed out, it doesn't reach those who are traditionally unreached. And if I can just say a little about the role of the telcos, and here we as HealthServe have are focusing during this humanitarian crisis on the mental health aspects, and the three dominant telcos here in Singapore have been very kind. They have provided us whatever we want in terms of SMS blast to all the subscribers about the services that are available and how to call for help. And I think it's gotten especially pertinent now when this morning it was announced that one of the workers quite unfortunately appeared to have committed suicide whilst an inpatient in one of the hospitals. So I really cannot overemphasize Mel's earlier point that the psychological aspects are really, really just as important, if not more important, in the battle against COVID-19. So on the technology side, Singapore has a ton of it, but it has elected to not use most of it for essentially privacy reasons.
Lauren just made me think of one other thing too. In terms of the epidemiological contact tracing side of things, actually that's also the data gathering there is actually done through ethnographic data collection. So it's really looking at where do people go and hang out? How do people eat? For example, do they share cups? Or utensils? Do they eat with their hands? If they do, so it's all of the kind of ethnographic behavioral data actually that's also helping people, do some of the tracing and the connection, dot connecting, I guess, too.
Maybe Lauren,
Thank you,
permit
Chairman
me a
Melissa.
minute. If you permit me a minute, I will just share that what also has been done is that we as HealthServe have launched a website and a chatbot that the workers can then go onto and ask questions. And out of these questions, we're then mining the insights. What are they concerned about? And we then take these insights, we feed them back to the government at the aggregate level. And like in this current crisis, I can share that the three biggest concerns are food, salary. To salary is the ability, because local dormitories have down. And lastly, there is a fear of getting, because there are just so many of them every coming down with the disease. And I believe if the government can address these three aspects, food, salary, or financial issues, and this very understandable fear of being infected, then the dormitory issues can be much more easily managed.
Thank you, Jeremy. You just mentioned the issue of psychological stress, and you also mentioned the issue of lockdown fatigue. The question is, what are the signs? What should people look for to kind of realize that this is starting to happen? Obviously, it's going to happen, but what are the signs you're looking for, and what are the plans? How do you think cities can deal with lockdown fatigue, and are there strategies in place, particularly in Singapore, to deal with it?
Yeah. No, I think we have to preserve the social relationships, whether they're done virtually or through other medium. But the social relationships are very crucial to mental health. I think that the regularity of some form of really schedule would be important, and the baseline factors like adequate food, adequate rest, and so on are very important. And if I go back to the worker population, they are not just concerned about the issues that I had raised, but being locked up in a dorm or in a room for 6 weeks to protect yourself and to protect others can be very debilitating. And some of the NGOs have done a really good job in mobilizing things like books and carom boards and all these. And they not only signal that people care, but it gives the workers something very tangible to do. And something that I know that the hospitals are now doing, mobilizing some of the workers who have recovered from really COVID-19. Can they be leaders or really guides for the newer workers who are just coming in, who have just been diagnosed? Because it's a very fearful journey. And this sort of community, grassroots, bottom-up organization gives a lot of purpose and a lot of meaning, and helps us all to collect, really make it through better.
That's right. Francis, I just want to add then too, just in terms of more Gen Pop kind of lockdown responses too, that the three things that you know, my team has been focused on there too is recover a sense of perspective, a sense of purpose, and have a sense of humor. And so if we can do that ourselves too, then just to remember to maintain perspective on everything else that's happening out there, you know, a purpose to be able to assist and help where we can, and then lastly, just to laugh as much as possible too in this time.
Thank you for that very good advice. And as we come to a close, there's one last question that we wanted to fit in here. And so if you don't mind responding quickly, it's not an easy one, I'm warning you. But do you see an end in sight? What does the scenario look like, in particular as a health expert?
I am very optimistic that Singapore will tide through this crisis. There will be a couple of bruises, and hopefully we'll be a lot smarter and wiser. But we'll certainly see the end of 19. The expectation of the public at least, and so different countries. Healthcare capacity. And back to you, Laura.
Thank you, and thank you for taking that last question. I would just want to take this opportunity to thank both you, Jeremy, and Melissa for very practical, really insightful, and even at times, you know, keeping that sense of humor about us, even in the hardest times. So thank you so much for being with us tonight and sharing Singapore's learnings so clearly. I want to let all the participants know we are going to be back again at this time next week. We have a presentation that will be on health and equity from city to state. And we'll have the mayor of Louisville, Kentucky, Mayor Fisher, with us, as well as the Chief Resilience Officer, Carmen Moreno Rivera, and also Eric Friedlander, who's the former Chief Resilience Officer and now is the Health Cabinet Deputy Secretary for the state of Kentucky. And we've all talked about the importance of cities and states and whole of government approaches. Next week, we'll have the opportunity to talk to folks who are living this and enacting it. So please do join us. As always, we will share the presentations as well as the Q&A record with all of you. We'll make it available online. And again, I just wanted to say thank you to Melissa and Jeremy for all your work. Let's all keep on advocating for our most vulnerable and fighting the good fight, and we will get through this together. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.